Hello, I'm Jamie Hartmann-Boyce, and I'm going to talk us briefly through the findings from our most recent update of our Cochrane review of electronic cigarettes for smoking cessation, published this October 2020. This update was supported by the Cochrane Incentives Award Scheme and the University of Oxford Returning Carers Fund, as well as through funding from the National Institute for Health Research and from Cancer Research UK. And I don't have any conflicts of interest to declare. So what I'll cover today, I'll briefly cover Cochrane and e-cigarettes, although I'm assuming many of you will already know all about Cochrane and our e-cigarette work. And then I will summarize the key findings from our most recent update to our Cochrane review of electronic cigarettes for smoking cessation and talk about the implications and next steps that follow on from those findings. So Cochrane is a global non-profit organization that exists to help decision makers make decisions about various different healthcare interventions. It does this by gathering and combining the best evidence to determine the benefits and risks of these treatments or interventions, and it does this by creating systematic reviews with a really strong emphasis on trying to find out the strengths and weaknesses of the individual studies and whether or not we can trust them. And Cochrane systematic reviews, the methods they use are considered gold standard, so the best way to figure out whether or not an intervention works. E-cigarettes have been around now for over a decade and have grown really rapidly in their increase in popularity over that time. And the technology has also evolved quite a bit from their initial introduction. So e-cigarettes are devices which heat a liquid into an aerosol for inhalation. That components of that can vary, but it may or may not contain flavors, and also it may or may not contain nicotine. For the purpose of this presentation and this review, what we are focused on is e-cigarettes with nicotine, also sometimes comparing those to e-cigarettes without nicotine, but we're not looking at the use of e-cigarettes for delivery of other sorts of drugs. For example, e-cigarettes delivering THC are out of scope for this review. So there are different models of e-cigarettes available. There's different nomenclature for these. They're typically referred to as first, second, third, or fourth generation devices, and there are some pictures there of different device types. E-cigarettes all store e-liquid or juice, and what it's stored in can vary, a disposable or refillable cartridge or a reservoir, and that will depend on the type of device. And the nicotine content will vary from no nicotine at all to quite high doses of nicotine. Sometimes e-cigarette users are described as vapors and e-cigarette use as vaping. So the objective of this Cochrane review, which was first published in 2014 and then updated in 2016 and now updated in October 2020, is to evaluate the safety and effect of using e-cigarettes to help people smoke achieve long-term smoking abstinence. In order to look at this question, we looked at two different types of studies. So we looked at randomized controlled trials in which people who smoke were randomized to an e-cigarette or a control condition, and also at uncontrolled intervention studies. So those were studies in people who smoke, where everyone in the study was offered the same electronic cigarette intervention. In terms of outcomes, our measure of benefit was smoking cessation at 6 months or longer, and we're also interested in measures of harm at 1 week or longer of e-cigarette use. There are many comparisons included in this review, and I won't have time to go through all of them in this presentation. So for the purpose of this presentation, we're focusing on our three primary comparisons. Those are studies comparing nicotine e-cigarettes versus nicotine replacement therapy, referred to as NRT throughout this presentation. Those comparing nicotine e-cigarettes against behavioral support only or no support, and those studies comparing nicotine e-cigarettes with e-cigarettes without nicotine. And previously we had also referred to those as placebo e-cigarettes. So non-nicotine e-cigarettes and placebo e-cigarettes in the context of this review mean the same thing. In terms of our outcomes, our primary outcomes are indicated with stars on this slide. So cessation, as is common practice across all tobacco addiction reviews within the Cochrane Tobacco Addiction Group, was measured as cessation at 6 months or longer, using an intention to treat basis with people who weren't followed up, considered continuing smokers, We use the strictest definition of abstinence and biochemically verified data where available. We're also interested in adverse events and serious adverse events at 1 week or longer. And in addition to secondary outcomes, which I won't have time to focus on during this presentation, but for which full data is available in the review itself, we're looking at changes in relevant biomarkers. So that included known carcinogens and toxicants, and things like exhaled carbon monoxide, measures of airway and lung function, blood pressure, blood oxygen levels, etc. We searched, the most recent search was in January 2020. We searched 7 electronic databases and also contacted researchers in the field and searched trial registries and conference abstracts for ongoing studies. And after these searches, this most version of the review includes 50 studies. 35 of those are new, and these studies in total represent over 12,000 participants. The next couple slides, I'm just going to go through in a bit of detail the characteristics of the studies that are included in this version of the review. So of our included studies, only 4 were judged to be at low overall risk of bias. That means they were judged to be at low risk of bias across all the domains we considered. 9 were judged to be at unclear risk, which basically means we didn't have enough information with which to decide. And 37 were judged to be at high risk of bias. Now, it's important to note that that 37 includes all of the non-randomized studies included in this review. So it wasn't necessarily that we were saying that the trials that we included were at high risk of bias, but rather that by nature of their design, the uncontrolled studies were rated at high risk of bias. In terms of the funding or source of support of the included studies, 8 of them were funded by the electronic cigarette industry or received some support from the industry. 32 had absolutely no electronic cigarette industry funding or support, and for 10 this wasn't reported. And of the 50 studies, 26 were randomized controlled trials, 3 were randomized crossover trials, and 21 were uncontrolled cohort studies, where everyone in the study was offered the same electronic cigarette intervention. Of those 26 included randomized controlled trials, 12 of them contributed to our cessation meta-analyses. Onwards to talk a little bit more about our included studies. In terms of the interventions they tested, 45 of the 50 tested the use of a nicotine e-cigarette alone. 4 of them tested a combination of nicotine e-cigarettes and nicotine replacement therapy, and 1 tested a combination of nicotine e-cigarettes and varenicline. In terms of comparators, for those studies which had comparators, 8 compared the nicotine EC with a non-nicotine electronic cigarette. 12 compared a nicotine electronic cigarette with behavioral support only or no support. 8 compared the devices to nicotine replacement therapy, and 1 compared them to varenicline. And in terms of device type, this was sometimes difficult to define because there is a limited amount of detail available, but 25 of them were what we would refer to as cartridge type devices, so typically first generation devices. 18 of them tested refillable devices, so that might commonly be thought of as a second generation device. 2 tested a combination of both, and 5 didn't report their device type. So as expected, because there's always a lag between product availability and research testing those products in this context, we didn't find very many studies on newer electronic cigarette devices, which has been the case with every update of this review. In terms of our outcomes, 20 of the 50 studies reported abstinence at 6 months or longer, 34 reported adverse events, and 23 reported serious adverse events, and you can see the breakdown for our secondary outcomes there as well. The outcomes in orange are our primary outcomes and are the ones I'll be focusing on for the remainder of this presentation. When we looked at pooling the results for our first comparison, which was nicotine e-cigarettes compared to nicotine replacement therapy, looking at our outcome of benefit, which was quitting smoking at 6 months or longer, we found moderate certainty evidence of a benefit in favor of nicotine e-cigarettes. So basically, more people in the groups assigned to nicotine e-cigarettes quit than those assigned to nicotine replacement therapy in the 3 trials we had that looked at this comparison and this outcome. In all Cochrane reviews, we rate the certainty of evidence for our primary outcomes and our primary comparisons, and this really represents how certain we are that future studies won't change the effect that we found. And here our certainty is moderate, and we downgraded it. So the reason it's not high is due to imprecision. So simply the fact that we still don't have that many studies, and of the studies we do have, the number of events is comparatively small. So more studies would strengthen, most likely, our certainty in this outcome, but we need to find them because our confidence intervals are still wide, and we're looking forward to incorporating those in the future. Sticking with this comparison, if we then look at nicotine e-cigarettes compared to nicotine replacement therapy and looking at the outcome of adverse events at 1 week or longer, we find no difference in the number of events or number of participants experiencing adverse events. Here, the certainty of the evidence was considered low, and this again was due to imprecision. So we have wide confidence intervals, which incorporate potential harm as well as potential benefit, and again, few studies with few events contributing data. We have a similar picture when it comes to serious adverse events when comparing nicotine e-cigarettes against nicotine replacement therapy. Again, as you'll notice here, our numbers are particularly low. This is partly because in one of the studies measuring this outcome, there were no events, so it can't contribute data. So actually the only data we have to inform our estimates comes from one trial, and therefore we downgraded this to low based on imprecision. It has very wide confidence intervals, which means we can't rule out significant benefit or significant harm. So moving on to our next comparison, which was looking at nicotine e-cigarettes compared to non-nicotine e-cigarettes, and looking at quitting at 6 months. Here again, we found an effect in favor of the intervention. And here again, our certainty in the evidence was moderate due to imprecision, meaning essentially we didn't have that many studies and they didn't contribute that much data to this analysis. So our confidence intervals are really quite wide. When we looked at adverse events for this comparison, as you'll see, we found no difference, but again, wide confidence intervals with a great certainty of evidence downgraded to low due to very serious imprecision. And for serious adverse events, again, very little data here, only one study driving data because the other studies that tested it didn't record any events. And again, very low certainty due to wide confidence intervals because of imprecision. What is worth noting is that these studies that did set out to measure serious adverse events that didn't find any also tell us that at least in these studies, the occurrence of those events was rare. Moving on to our third and final comparison, which I'll cover, is nicotine e-cigarettes versus behavioral support only or no support. So essentially, our first comparison, which compared nicotine e-cigarettes with nicotine replacement therapy, was arguably testing the behavioral, social, and psychological components of e-cigarettes because both groups were receiving nicotine. Our second comparison was looking at e-cigarettes with nicotine versus e-cigarettes without nicotine. And essentially there was looking at nicotine delivery of e-cigarettes because all of the other aspects were controlled for. And here in this comparison, what we're bringing together is both the pharmacological aspects of an e-cigarette, if it contains nicotine, and also the behavioral, social, and psychological potential mechanisms of action. And here, when we pooled data from 4 studies, we found, again, evidence of a benefit of nicotine e-cigarettes. However, our certainty in this evidence was very low. This was downgraded 2 levels due to risk of bias. And here, again, we also do not have a huge amount of data. But these studies, essentially, by their very nature, couldn't blind participants. Participants would know if they were receiving an e-cigarette or not, and that is why these have been flagged up as risk of bias. What I would say about the effect estimate we're observing here is that the fact that our other 2 comparisons showed benefits of the intervention would make me more comfortable with thinking that indeed there is probably a benefit for this comparison as well. When we looked at adverse events at a week or longer, here we saw a slight increase in adverse events in those receiving nicotine e-cigarettes versus behavioral support only or no support. Here again, however, certainty was very low due to issues with risk of bias and imprecision. Of note, the most commonly reported adverse effects tended to dissipate over time and were things like throat and mouth irritation, cough, etc. And you can find more details on types of adverse events in the full review. For serious adverse events at a week or more, again, a similar picture as we've seen for serious adverse events in the other comparisons, where we have very little data. The studies that did measure it, only 2 of them detected any events in any arms. There's some imprecision between them, and very wide confidence intervals. So here, certainty very low due to risk of bias in the studies, and also the imprecision and the wide confidence intervals. So all Cochrane reviews end with implications for practice and implications for research. And this is what we make of the data I've presented today, and also the data in the full review, which I'd encourage you to look at after this presentation. So, as I've just discussed and described, the evidence suggesting nicotine and e-cigarettes can aid in smoking cessation is quite consistent across several comparisons. There was moderate certainty evidence, limited by imprecision, that e-cigarettes with nicotine increase quit rates at 6 months or longer compared to non-nicotine e-cigarettes and compared to NRT. The evidence was lower certainty when comparing e-cigarettes with nicotine to behavioural support only or no support. The effect of nicotine e-cigarettes when added to nicotine replacement therapy was unclear. I wasn't able to cover that in this particular presentation, but you are able to see the analyses of that in the full review. Of note, none of the included studies, which were up to 2 years, detected serious adverse events considered possibly related to e-cigarette use, but there are caveats there in that we didn't have very much data on this, and certainly we didn't have very much long-term data here. The most commonly reported adverse events, as noted earlier, were throat and mouth irritation, headache, cough, and nausea, and these tended to dissipate over time. And in terms of our secondary outcomes, which I didn't cover here, but again, which I'd encourage listeners to tune into the full review for, we did see some studies showing reductions in biomarkers that were quite consistent with the reductions we'd expect to see from people who quit smoking using other methods. In terms of implications for research, this is a continued call, I suppose, for more research in this area. We don't have high certainty in any of our findings, and for many cases that is simply because we don't have enough studies, and we don't have big enough studies to help really nail down the effect estimate that we're looking for. In terms of future trials, our suggestions, and certainly wish, is that they would measure cessation at 6 months or longer, use active comparators, which is probably the most clinically relevant comparison. If someone's looking at using e-cigarettes for smoking cessation, they might be considering the benefits and disadvantages of using that against something like nicotine replacement therapy or varenicline. They should assess the safety profile for as long as possible and also be powered to detect differences in safety outcomes, because you will have noticed that for our safety outcomes in particular, we really had a paucity of data. They would present safety ideally in both absolute and relative risk terms. So this is an important point, and especially for this review, for many people, the option might be either switching to an e-cigarette or continuing to smoke tobacco, continuing to use cigarettes. So it would be useful to think about the potential harms of e-cigarettes, both absolutely, but also relative to continuing to use combustible tobacco. Ideally, and this is key, but I know very challenging, they'd offer recent devices to participants in order to be representative of what will be on the market at the time results are released. Data on pod-type e-cigarettes, so this includes things like Juul, are particularly and notably lacking. And we would like to see, as with all trials and studies in all areas, protocols and statistical analysis plans registered in advance and openly available. As noted above, trials of pod devices are incredibly key, and randomized controlled trials here would be very, very useful. And ideally, trials would also try providing electronic cigarettes in a way that would be used in real-world settings. And finally, it's probably worth saying that this review is very much focused on the use of e-cigarettes in people who are smoking combustible cigarettes at baseline. And there is certainly a need, which is out of the scope of this review, for further reviews using the best available methods to evaluate the possible relationships between e-cigarette use and availability and youth uptake of electronic cigarettes and conventional cigarettes. So that was a bit of a whirlwind tour of what is a very large and detailed review. And I'd encourage anyone listening to see the full review for more detail on everything that I've presented today. That includes secondary outcomes, data on other comparisons, for example, the use of electronic cigarettes as an adjunct to nicotine replacement therapy, data from our uncontrolled studies, and also for some exploration of comparisons with other reviews and what they found. It is also worth noting that from this update onwards, this review transitions into a living systematic review. That is a project supported by Cancer Research UK, and essentially what it means is that every month from December onwards, we will be updating the searches, and where we find new data, we'll be updating the review with that, so that the review is always much more up to date than it has been over the past few years. Thanks very much.